Hi, folks. I'm Camberley Bates. I'm with the Evaluator Group as an industry analyst firm, and it's really great to be here the second time around for Container Native Data Management Days. That is such a long word. Anyway, so I've got a great group, and I know that Tom talked about diversity, and I'm really sorry that he talked about age. You know, we've got the oldies and we've got the youngies up here. And then the other diversity that we have up here is Tel Aviv, Boston, Canada, Phoenix, and Boulder. So we come from all over the place here. And then there's the other obvious one that I guess he's referring to or something like that. So our conversation here is talking from pilot to standardization, the next frontier of containers. At Evaluator Group, we talk to a lot of end users, and most of our work is with the IT infrastructure guys, not the developers. And you know, there's a lot of angst going on with containers coming in. Sorry about that. I'm going to quote a VP of IT who's making this transition. And he says, please move this from pilot to standardization so we can scale it and sustain it. But oh, by the way, don't slow innovation or lose any key created developer resources. Also, figure out a strategy for the existing stateful apps. And by the way, figure out how to get this to the edge as well. And while you're at it, that's all we have to do. So, and we're like talking about, you know, enormous amount of work that's going on. So this panel is going to talk about, from a technology perspective, what it's like or what their experiences are, both from developers and operational kind of folks, about getting to a real standard world and where we can scale, and both in the VM environment as well as in the cloud and all the issues around it. So with that, let me introduce my folks. And I'm going to flip my page around, because I don't trust my memory at all. On the very, very far end, we have Addie Polak. She's Senior Manager, Cloud Scale Analytics for Microsoft. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Next one, I have Alison Dowdney. She's Developer Advocate for Weaveworks. She's our youngest of the group. Then we have Xing from VMware, and I think many of you probably know her from the Cloud Native Storage Tech Lead at VMware, as well as running the Kubernetes Storage Co-Chair here at CNCF. Welcome. And last but not least is Janae Stow, and she is on our staff, a senior analyst covering the container platforms. So now that I've dropped my notes, good to meet you all. Okay. First question, and this is a rapid fire question with everybody, so quick. Around the group, what makes getting to full production in containers difficult? What's the top one? And if you want to give me two, that's great. So we'll start out with you.
I'll say observability and security.
I'll say it is your data and authorization.
I'll say like the technical expertise, and also the gap between what the developers want and what the operators want.
And I'll add getting the right skill mix to be able to make it all happen, along with the change in processes that are frequently required, including increased collaboration.
There we go. So I think a bunch of people have seen a lot of the data that's around getting containers to production, and the biggest thing that we all have heard about is the skills. Maybe you guys could talk a little bit about what your experience is with the skills. Why are the skills so challenging right now? Who wants to take that one?
I can take that.
Go for it.
Well, the way I see it, it's such a big landscape. So many technologies are around that, and also having developers being kind of wearing the hat of the DevOps and understanding IT and networking and how things works, I think brings a lot of challenges to how developers work. And also the idea of how we do observability in containers versus how we used to do observability over VMs. For example, if I have some process running in production and I'm having issues with that, how can I debug it? What can I see? Should I restart that process? If I'm working with containers, should I kill the pod and kind of launch it all over? Or am I missing some of the data that actually is precious there? Because I do want to investigate. I do want to understand what's the issue that's currently happening in production and blocking some of my customers.
Janae?
So one of the things that came out in our interviews that we did with a large number of enterprise customers was the challenge of finding skills and then deciding you couldn't find them and having to develop them in-house. People who went and looked for ready skills to hire found that the leads were often buried in large cloud service provider environments where they were extremely well paid and where they had career paths that were extremely well developed. So it was very difficult to pull people out of there. And so as a second step, they then decided, well, maybe I can find, or I can afford to find one of these people as a lead, but then I need to build my skills in-house. And people were struggling with exactly how to do that, but found some very creative ways to build those skills in-house by collaborating across development and operations teams and identifying folks who were interested in expanding their skills and bringing them on board in very creative ways.
That's awesome. How about the other guys? Folks, you want to chime in?
Hi, yeah, I'll chime in here. So, yeah, chiming in on what these other wonderful ladies have said before. Skills, there is a giant skill shortage. Like, if you look out, for instance, the amount of people who are looking for developers who have those cloud-native skills, everyone wants those skills now, and there is not enough people to fill those roles. And then even when you do get someone, that one person has now got the burden as well of trying to evangelize and help, trying to evangelize and get cloud native, picked up by other people in the company who have done things for a while in a completely different manner. Like the whole shift to cloud native, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because what we had on the last panel was, I'll call her out, Audrey Resnick. And she was with an oil company and was doing some things that were incredibly creative. And she'd get into meetings and they'd go, well, where are you coming up with this? Where are you coming up with this? Where are you coming up with this? And so half her time was educating the people around her that were so used to doing research the way they were always doing their research, as opposed to where the new ones are coming. Is my mic coming in and out? Yes, it is. So thank you very much. That was quite smooth. Thank you. So anyway, so that is one of the biggest areas. And I know that Xing is working quite a bit on some of the areas that have to do with people. Data is, it's gravity. It's got big gravity. And we're relearning this all over again, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think data definitely is a challenge. How to manage data and how to come up with like standardization of the data management APIs. I think that's definitely a big challenge. But if you just look at what we are doing with CSI as an example, in the early days when CSI is just an initiative, we have 4 container orchestration systems, Kubernetes, Mesos, Docker, and Cloud Foundry. They came together to design this industry standard, have a common set of APIs for storage vendors to develop one plugin and have it work across a range of container orchestration systems. And so we've come a long way. Now, of course, Kubernetes is the dominant force now. The CSI has APIs to support the management of volume life cycles and be able to influence the scheduling of the volumes on the nodes and have APIs to manage the storage capacity, like volume expansion, monitor the volumes, like volume health. So it has more and more features now. But also, we are now also trying to add support for object storage. CSI is for block and file. So now we are working on this cozy container object storage interface, trying to add object storage support, provision object buckets, and then have a set of gRPC APIs, so that the vendor can write a plugin, so that they can provision buckets on their storage backends. So that's a feature that we are working on, trying to bring it to alpha in the coming 23 release. Yeah, so definitely we are seeing more and more standardization of APIs for different storage types.
More things to learn.
Yeah,
definitely.
that's true. Yeah, I think the data conversation is fascinating. I mean, we always kind of know the data is there. We need those stateful application. We need to be able to connect with the different object stores, right? We have the data lake and there are different data lake in the different clouds, and then we have the on-prem, and we need to have like a unified system to connect to all of them from one place, especially if we see kind of a flow of people going towards the hybrid cloud or kind of connecting on-prem with a specific cloud provider. And also it brings challenges, because having a stateful application that runs either on containers, on a Kubernetes, or on VMs, depends on how we build it, bring the challenges of how do we make sure it's reproducible, right? How do we make sure we're qualifying that distributed data that just flows into the system? How do we make sure we're building kind of a system that helps us look and see and kind of have eyes into what's going on with the data in the system, and also adding governance, because we know, if we're working with healthcare data or anything like that, we definitely have to make sure we're building it with governance in mind and where the data is, which data center is at, how do we use it. If we use different cloud services, we sometimes don't know how it's really being transferred to or how it's being used behind the scenes. So I'm thinking having those tools is definitely necessary. I know there are some open source now that only started. One of them that I'm looking into is LakeFS. It's not part of the CNCF yet because it's relatively small, but maybe in the future we'll see. We'll try to convince the founders. But what it gives you kind of a CI/CD over the data flows that you're running in your production environment. It doesn't have to be in production. It can be also staging or development. But it gives you the ability to test and qualify your data automatically using some YAML files or YAML configurations, for example.
That's great. So I want to quote another one of our clients that talked about the containers entering IT ops, and that gets into the stateful kind of environment that they're used to looking at. The quote is, developers are pushing containers. Their long-term strategy is for IT to partner with development and support containers. How do we manage that? We'll need a whole gamut from provisioning to monitoring of tools. So that gets back to what you guys were saying, is if we're going to scale this, if we're going to get to an operational place, there's this gap that seems to be between the developers and the IT. And I know that one of the real key things is that IT needs to, or the IT ops got to reach over to the developers and collaborate. What do the developers have to do? And I'm going to pass it down to you two or you three because you're developers. What do the developers have to do to work better with IT, and the IT ops, that is?
So except for the soft.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Yeah. So actually, in our team, we're actually going through this transformation of having the dev team to become service owners. So which means actually the developers will be taking on the role of SREs. So we start by define what are the SLIs and SLOs. So in our case, it's the
SLIs?
SLIs.
What's an SLI?
So it's the service level indicator.
Indicator, okay.
Service, and service level objective.
Objective, yeah.
Yeah, so in our case, for the CSI drivers, that's the success and the failure rate of CSI operation, like provisioning a volume, deleting a volume, things like that. Duration of the operation, like performance side. Volume health, so whether the volume stays accessible after it's provisioned and used by a pod, the uptime of the pod and the PVCs, and whether there are orphaned volumes left there for some reason. So we're looking at all of those and trying to set alerts if there's a SLO violation. And for the SLO violation, we also try to write runbooks so that when the alert is generated, SRE get notified and try to execute those runbooks and try to resolve those problems. So the end goal is try to really, in the end, automate this process of troubleshooting and remediation. So of course, this is like an iterative process, right? So we have to go back and forth and review it and try to improve it. But we do want to have our developers really to become service owners, so that they actually, wear the hat of the operator and learn the pain of operating. And I think that will be helpful to improve our user experience.
Okay.
Alison?
Yep. So I think the biggest thing you can do to make this whole process of getting your IT and your developers to be able to easily collaborate together is to find really nice happy mediums that they both can grasp and understand. So for instance, if folks are really familiar with Terraform, you can use Terraform for both your Kubernetes YAMLs and for your infrastructure, right? And if you can lower the burden and complexity of the amount of stuff people have to learn, it's going to make it so much easier. And another added bonus on that, if you can use something that people can already relate to and understand. So if your teams are familiar with VMware software or with Go programming. So I know Pulumi does, I think, Go APIs for interacting with like the cloud and Kubernetes and all that. Yeah, find nice happy mediums and collaborate, communicate. Yeah, off to Eddie now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is a tough question. I think, well, first, develop empathy. I mean, those are your colleagues. You need to work together. And the second thing is a little bit about how we structure people to work together is what are the KPIs, the OKRs, the responsibilities. We know the developer responsible for developing the actual logic. Maybe they're building some infrastructure, those kind of things, versus our IT folks, our DevOps folks are in charge of kind of making sure everything works well, everything is scalable, the network works well, it's secure, there's governance attached to it, there is observability systems, CI/CD pipeline if we have those. So kind of making sure we're aligning responsibilities or goals between those different teams, or sometimes even building a team that has both the DevOps, the IT person, and the developer kind of working in a module rather than kind of an excellence center that can help around the processes. And also communicate. I mean, the more we communicate the work that people are doing, congratulating them on the work, it definitely creates an impact. And also understanding the different roles and responsibility. I remember, I think it was 6 years back, as a developer, I was put on a project together with a DevOps. I was responsible for making sure that different resources between a batch cluster that we have and a streaming cluster that we have are not colliding, and there's no, we're utilizing everything, there's no idle time, and actually when there are peaks in stream processing, high throughput that we need to process things very fast, we actually can leverage the different resources also from the batch. So I was sitting down together with the DevOps, and we tried to figure out how we're building that infrastructure to support that and be agile and flexible enough in order to utilize the cluster to the maximum. And I remember, I was digging into their work, and I was fascinated by all the scripts that they were writing, the way they're thinking about things, the way they were solving things. And at least for me, I respect them. They're doing amazing job, and ever since we're interacting and we're having conversation, I definitely understand their side of the story as well. Although I know, there's logic, there's work to be done, they also are doing their work, and it's super important for everything to work together.
Can I add something on to Adi's
Go
point?
for it.
All right. So it seems like whenever we make changes like this, there's 3 legs on a stool for making it successful. One is, and the one that seems to always get so much attention, perhaps too much attention, is how we organize. The second is how we motivate people to be successful. And the third is how we communicate. And what I'm hearing from what Adi said is that if we do the right kind of communication and we create shared success metrics and can measure against those metrics across those people who are involved in a kind of a multi-people-in-a-box environment, that the organization is less critical, and motivating people properly and ensuring good communication is more of the answer. Is that right?
Absolutely. Amen to that. Everyone will do that, and we'll be better.
Be nirvana.
Yeah.
And I'm also hearing another piece that I picked up here from Alison is that the first time I looked at the open source tools, everybody's seen one of those charts that have got all the names on there, and you kind of look at it and you go, oh my goodness. Actually, I would actually say a 4-letter word there, but we're in a public conversation. So, and it's kind of like, how do you choose? And then that issue about what the tools are that I'm using, as I get back to what the guy said, is that I've got a whole new gamut of things that I've got to put in place in order to support this environment. And then they don't even know what they're talking about. So that's probably also another piece of that. Somebody looked like they were just about to jump in, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, so the tools, I think some of you might have seen that meme where there's the CNCF landscape on a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle box, because it is that big, and just trying to understand that, piece that together, and find out, what things in there align best with what you should do in your org. Yeah, it's a challenge. And there is, there is no perfect way to navigate that challenge, but there are ways you can get through that challenge and leverage what you have.
So let me, you touched on something, one of you did touch, I think it was actually on this question of to VM or not to VM. And what that means there is that there's, we've had debates in our company, actually pretty lively debate about a week ago about this. Do you put containers on top of a VM environment, or do you put it on bare metal? Can I get a raise of hands out there? On VMs? How many people want to do on VMs? How many people want bare metal only? There was less of those hands, the last ones. Okay, but that doesn't mean you get the vote completely. That's not. So let's continue the debate up here. Why would one want to put it on a VM? Xing? You're setting her up because she's from VMware. There we go. But she has both sides of the story, so go for it.
Well, I definitely can see there are use cases for both, so I'm not really going to pick one side or the other. So now actually on vSphere, right, you can actually have this VM operator where you can actually provision VM using declarative Kubernetes APIs. So this way you can actually manage your VMs and your containers through the same management interface. So I think that's also very interesting, and I think will be more customers would be interested in having that.
Okay, so I'm the other side of this.
I know you are.
I was part of the lively discussion. So the concern that I have, honestly, about managing VMs and containers together, and it's more about the management layer than it is the underlying infrastructure, is that these two architectures are so different. And the one that comes up the most often when I talk with customers is customers who have started their container pilots and they want to know where their vMotion is. To me, that indicates that they don't really understand how containers are supposed to work or what the architecture is good for. And so I worry when we think about managing them together that we may be setting up our operations staff for errors, because they have an expectation that things are going to work the way they used to work, and they work in an entirely different way. That doesn't mean that it can't be successful or that you can't get benefit out of it, but I worry that by not understanding what tools are good for, when you use a ball peen hammer or a sledgehammer to put in a finish nail, your cupboard's not going to look very good, no matter how good the workman. That's and I recognize there's another side to this argument, but that's what I worry about.
But that's not to say that VM is a sledgehammer kind of environment. It's still, when it's on itself. It's a tool within itself. It's not
precisely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting debate. We don't always have access to bare metal, right? Not all of us work on-prem or building the next cloud. So it's an interesting conversation into what is the usage of, running our containers directly on bare metal versus running our containers on VMs that is often on the cloud. And also if we want to expand our, let's say we're running on-prem, and now there's a huge move to digitalization, especially now with COVID-19. We've seen a lot of companies are moving to the cloud. They want to build their IT in-house department to build different services for customers that are using online and cloud tools. So a lot of them want to expand, and the way they expand using the cloud, the public cloud. It's easier to manage, and it's easier to get hardware. I remember when we used to order hardware a couple of years ago, and with my previous company, you have to wait for a year or something like that to get the hardware installed and in place. I mean, we had to predict how much compute and how much disk and how much capacity and networking we will need in order to support our upcoming products and services. So it was a totally different conversation than what we have now, where the cloud is relatively vibrant and more easy to use and consume. So I think it's definitely a conversation on how we want to use it, where are we building, what are we doing, more than anything else, in my opinion.
So I think you just reminded me of something that I heard last week from the VMware. There was an announcement for VMware Cloud on AWS Outpost. So AWS Outpost allow you to run AWS Cloud on-prem, and now with VMware Cloud on AWS Outpost, then you actually have vSphere environment running on AWS Cloud and on-prem, so you have everything blend together. And then the VMware Cloud also has integration with other cloud providers like Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle, IBM, and Alibaba. So now you actually can move easily or easier across cloud and between on-prem and the cloud environment. Yeah.
And we're seeing that across a lot of folks. I mean, if the AWS Anywhere kind of concept as well, that was announced recently. You've got, as we were talking on this morning, is that you've got the managed service offerings that are, more or less in the cloud. You've got the service offerings on-prem. So the concept then is to be in potentially both places.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that we didn't mention this when we were talking about the skills challenge, but it's very relevant, which is that the new managed offerings, like the one from VMware, like the ones from some of the other firms in the industry, are another potential solution for customers trying to get started rapidly without having to build all the skills in-house, taking a managed service offering to get started. I know a lot of people started that initially with artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it now seems to be expanding more generically. And for a company that's just getting started, it seems like a great solution.
So I'm going to go to another topic that's kind of related to what we're saying here, is like the promise or the premise, I would say, of some of the containers beyond, going beyond the fast development and delivery, is to move seamlessly, to move, deploy, and operate in production in any quote-unquote cloud, cloud being off or on-prem, being Google, Amazon, Alibaba, whatever environment. So in our research, it seems that this works okay as long as you're within the same software mix. But when you start mixing things like I want to move from GKS to AKS, or if I want to move from there to Tanzu or something, it doesn't quite work that way. So can you guys comment about your experience on there and where we're at with that?
So I think, so this is a migration, right, across different Kubernetes clusters. I think there is a backup and restore tool, for example, like Valera. You can use that with Restic, then that actually has a way, if you are running user workloads which are using native Kubernetes APIs, then that actually can allow you to back up from one Kubernetes environment and restore in a different one. However, there are, of course, limitations, right? If you have special customer resources that is only available in one environment, but it's not available at all in the other, then there's no way to move it around. Yeah.
Other observations?
So my other observation, kind of building from the first question that we had, where data and authorization are our biggest challenges. Now with hybrid, you've got another challenge added on to that, which is networking, right? Because networking between all these cloud providers is completely different. And on top of that, with the networking, you've got security, because now with the data problem and going into production, some of y'all might have compliance that you need to go through. So things like GDPR, HIPAA, like that, those things are going to become a bigger challenge when you need to be able to make a solution that accommodates for each cloud provider in the hybrid kind of scenario there.
So you really have to think about where you're placing your data. Howdy?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some, like GDPR or HIPAA compliance or different compliances. You actually have to be aware of where your data, or if you're holding customers' data, where you're holding your customers' data at. So that means you'll need to be very specific and know and have a good data layer observability. I mean, it's definitely something that we're missing, in my opinion, in the ecosystem at the moment. It's something that we need in order to make better decisions and also be able to understand where our data going a second before it's going there, and we're kind of getting into compliance conversations. Also, the aspects of security. To be honest, in different clouds, security works in different ways. It's just the way it builds. Different restrictions, different way of defining how security works. So definitely one area to kind of dive into, understand how each one of those solutions in the different clouds operates. And for that, we're touching a little bit on the area of skills, like how can I find one or two people that know all of that, right? From experience from the 3 different clouds all together, so I can bring them in and kind of help me solve that challenge or actual problem. To do that.
Well, and that gets us back to what we were talking about, is some of the standards, is setting up some standardizations for the environment and deciding what that environment is going to look like, as opposed to, and that's where maybe operations comes to play here, is to set those in place.
And I have a burning thought as well to kind of add on to that. Now, when you're doing proof of concepts and you've gone and told a developer or engineer, right, we want to use Kubernetes. We've got this, proof of concept that's already running on Docker Swarm, Docker Compose, and they put it on Kubernetes and they'll do it, and they'll kind of, because it's a proof of concept and we're just trying to demonstrate this thing can work. We'll cut corners for some things, like, yes, we will, this is a sandbox environment. We're going to give everything, like admin access or something, so we can easily get this thing out the door to show we can do this. We're going to not worry about persistent data, or even when we do worry about persistent data, we might forget about disaster recovery and what happens when things go wrong with persistent volumes. Yes, I think I was talking to someone earlier and I was like, what happens when things go wrong with persistent volumes? And a chunk of people have the approach to, yes, let's just remove away the whole persistent volume and just start again. But when you're dealing in situations where you have to do data disaster recovery, right, you can restore to a state and then bam, what if you just got yourself into another deep hole where that state you restored to got you back into the disaster again? So, yeah.
Okay, so we're back to the usual issue of data being the problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, okay. That was a key for me to go on to the next thing. So I've already talked about the VMs. I've talked about, let's talk about clusters. One of the things we're seeing in the decision making that has to happen in terms of scaling is one big huge cluster or multi-clusters. And how do we manage that? And again, when we go to scale, and I'm thinking of the big companies of, where thousands and thousands and thousands of containers that we're operating in. And I mean, I think one of the clients I was talking to, we're talking about 20,000 containers, which is nothing. They seemed like that was a rounding error kind of stuff. Then you've got to look at how you manage, and the blast radius gets pretty big if you're doing single clusters. So they're going to multi-clusters, but then the management of that becomes really sticky. So any comments on that?
I can only say about an article I read recently about LinkedIn, how they are scaling their clusters, but it's actually a conversation about Hadoop, which is a totally different conversation. They're now working on open source solution because they are managing more than 10,000 nodes, and they're expecting some crazy growth in that, like to have like 20,000 nodes in their Hadoop ecosystem. So they are actually looking into mini sub-Hadoop clusters that are going to communicate the different jobs and workloads between them. So they're building an extra added layer. So the more multi-cluster approach, they're just having one huge cluster and expecting, everything to work and be contained. And I think in that point, one of the biggest challenges is, again, data. How do we manage those stateful applications if we're going all the way in with huge cluster, and then we have to have a distributed identification, right? Because we have to know where are the different objects in each given time, versus if we're deciding to go on the kind of multi-cluster and have kind of subs of different small clusters, where it's easier to manage those distributed identifications over a distributed data cluster.
So I think some of this too comes back to the issue of standards and whether or not your use cases are heterogeneous or homogeneous. Having 10,000, Kubernetes environments that all look alike because they're edge managers and the edge is all the same is obviously a different problem than if you've got a lot of different kinds of things going on. And it just gets back to the fact, I think, that when you go from pilot to standard, you have to think about how can I organize these things in such a way that someone who walks in straight off the street and I asked them to manage it would have a clue what it was they were supposed to do, which gets back to your concept of run books and basically having a set of homogeneous standards to work from.
Great. So I think we're about out of time. I'm going to just see if there's any questions that we had from the audience. It's not set up necessarily for that, but I want to give an opportunity for anybody to raise their hand if there is somebody that has a question. Okay. Great. Okay. So I want to say, and I can't see that well. So if there is, I apologize. I want to thank you guys very much for tuning in. It's a privilege to be able to come up here and talk about what the issues are. I think we are really into maybe the next 3 to 5 years, some really fun stuff and new technology that's going to be introduced in order to get there. We feel like we're just in the very, very early stages. Somebody was asking me when we're going to see the growth, like we saw maybe in the VM world, 10 years ago, and it's going to be a slow slog because you guys are refactoring applications and it's kind of a re-envisioning. Actually, I really hate that term, but anyway, envisioning a new world that we're doing development in. And so there's lots of challenges. And I think the biggest thing that I would take away from here is the collaboration that happens between the development team and the IT team, and that neither knows each other's side that well. But if we communicate and work together, we will learn what things we need to do to change and make this thing scale. So thank you very much.